650 meters below the surface of the Caribbean Sea, off the western tip of Cuba, a sonar array picked up something in 2001 that should not have been there at all. Geometric shapes, sharp angles, structures arranged with what looked unmistakably like intention, sitting on the ocean floor at a depth no human civilization should ever have been able to build at. The engineers who found it had been searching for shipwrecks. What their equipment recorded instead looked, to several people who reviewed the images, disturbingly like the ruins of a city, geometric platforms, what appeared to be pyramid-like structures, organized across roughly 2 square kilometers of seafloor. Here is the number that makes this genuinely strange, rather than merely a curiosity. Sea levels at the end of the last ice age were, at their absolute lowest point, roughly 120 meters below where they sit today. The structures off Cuba sit 5 times deeper than that. No accepted model of melting glaciers and rising oceans gets a city from dry land down to 650 meters. Not in 12,000 years, not in 50,000. So either the sonar found something that isn't what it appears to be, or something is fundamentally wrong with how we currently understand the recent history of this planet. That single, unresolved tension is the spine of this entire investigation. Around the world, in cultures with no apparent contact with one another, separated by oceans and thousands of years, ancient peoples preserved strikingly similar stories. A great civilization, sometimes called wise, sometimes called arrogant, destroyed by water and erased from the world almost entirely. For most of modern history, scholars filed these stories under mythology and moved on. They are not moving on quite so quickly anymore. Over the past 3 decades, underwater archaeology, ice core data, and a single, impossible archaeological site in Turkey have forced a real, serious, and so far unresolved scientific question back onto the table. One that would have been dismissed outright by most academics as recently as the 1980s. Did the last ice age end with a sea-level catastrophe severe enough to erase evidence of a forgotten chapter of human history? And did some of that erased history survive only as myth? Some of what follows is rigorously documented science. Some is genuine, active research at the frontier of archaeology. And some is speculation that mainstream researchers explicitly reject, sometimes for very good reasons. We will mark the difference clearly, every step of the way. Let's start with the myths themselves, because there are far more of them, and they are far older than most people realize. Nearly every literate ancient culture preserved some version of a catastrophic flood. The Sumerians told of Ziusudra, warned by a god to build a boat before the waters came. The later Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh borrows the same structure almost exactly, with a hero named Utnapishtim. 2 civilizations, centuries apart, telling essentially the same story. And that is only the beginning of the list. The Hebrew Bible gives the story its most famous form, Noah and the Ark. Hindu tradition tells of Manu, saved from a world-ending deluge by a fish. Greek mythology has Deucalion. Indigenous flood traditions appear across the Americas, from the Andes to the Pacific Northwest, entirely independent of any of these other sources. How many more independent versions of the same disaster does it take before coincidence stops being a satisfying answer? A nearly identical disaster, remembered in broad strokes by civilizations that, in several of these cases, had no plausible way of ever comparing notes. Mainstream folklorists and anthropologists generally explain this convergence the same way they explain most widespread mythological patterns. Humans have always lived near rivers, coastlines, and floodplains, and catastrophic, civilization-threatening floods are simply a recurring, universal hazard of that choice, virtually guaranteed to generate similar stories independently, again and again, in unconnected places. That explanation accounts for a great deal. It does not, on its own, explain why the most detailed and elaborate of these stories so often insist the destroyed civilization was advanced, wealthy, technologically accomplished, even arrogant in its mastery over nature, rather than simply unlucky. There is a further wrinkle worth sitting with, too. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions describe coastlines retreating and islands vanishing beneath the sea. Stories anthropologists have in some cases matched to documented post-Ice Age shoreline changes thousands of years before any written record existed anywhere on Earth. Chinese tradition preserves its own version in the legend of Gun and Yu, generations spent struggling to control a flood so severe it nearly undid civilization itself, finally resolved only through controlled engineering of the rivers rather than divine rescue. Two more flood stories from two more regions, neither one borrowing from the other, neither one borrowing from Mesopotamia. The pattern keeps widening rather than narrowing, which brings us to the single most famous lost civilization story ever told, and the one this episode has to handle with the most care because so much modern speculation has been built on top of it. In approximately 360 BCE, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, describing an island civilization called Atlantis, a sophisticated naval power, larger than Libya and Asia, combined according to the text, that warred against ancient Athens before being swallowed by the sea in a single catastrophic day and night. Here is the detail almost never mentioned in popular retellings. Plato is the only source. There's no earlier Greek text, no Egyptian record, no independent corroboration of Atlantis anywhere in the ancient world predating these two dialogues. Every single account of Atlantis that exists today traces back to one philosopher, writing one story within one set of philosophical dialogues, whose entire purpose, by Plato's own framing, was illustrating the dangers of hubris and excessive power, not recording history. Plato places the island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a phrase ancient Greeks generally understood to mean past the Strait of Gibraltar, out in the open Atlantic Ocean itself, a detail later writers and modern researchers alike have leaned on heavily, even though Plato never describes the island's precise location any more specifically than that single geographic marker. A 2,400-year-old story with exactly one ancient source and one vague geographic clue that launched centuries of expeditions, theories, and entire pseudo-disciplines dedicated to finding it. Mainstream classical scholars overwhelmingly read Atlantis as Plato's invented allegory, not a garbled memory of a real place, pointing specifically to its function within the dialogues, contrasting an idealized, virtuous Athens against a hubristic, overreaching Atlantis as a moral lesson about what happens to societies that abandon restraint. Notably, Plato never finished the Critias, the dialogue containing the most detailed Atlantis material, breaking off mid-sentence partway through, a detail scholars have never fully explained, and one that has fueled almost as much speculation as the story itself. That reading explains the story's purpose. It does not fully explain why Plato, alone among Greek writers of elaborate political allegories, chose to anchor his invented morality tale in such oddly specific geographic and chronological detail, including a destruction date he places some 9,000 years before his own lifetime. That number alone is worth pausing on, because it lands somewhere genuinely interesting. 9,000 years before Plato puts us at roughly 9,600 BCE, which is not an arbitrary point in prehistory. It sits almost exactly at the end of the last ice age, the very period when global sea levels were undergoing the most dramatic, rapid change of the last 100,000 years. Did Plato simply invent a suspiciously specific date for dramatic effect? Or did he, deliberately or not, anchor his philosophical fiction to the one moment in deep prehistory when an entire coastline really could plausibly have vanished beneath rising water? To answer that, we need to leave Plato behind entirely and look directly at what the planet was actually doing at the end of the Ice Age. Because what happened to global sea levels during this period is not myth and not speculation. It is measured, dated, and remarkably well documented. As the last Ice Age ended, immense ice sheets covering much of North America and Northern Europe began melting at a pace that, by some measurements, has never been matched since. Geologists call the most extreme bursts of this melting meltwater pulses. During one of these events, sea levels rose more than 7 meters in under 2 centuries, a rate of change that would be considered an active global emergency if it happened today. A rate of rise this fast did not happen once. It happened in at least 2 separate violent pulses, centuries apart, each one capable of redrawing a coastline within a single human generation. Across the full span of deglaciation, global sea levels rose by roughly 120 meters total. To put that in concrete terms, an area of coastline larger than the entire landmass of India was gradually, then in sudden violent pulses, swallowed by the ocean. Entire coastal plains, river deltas, and low-lying regions where early human populations would most plausibly have settled, simply vanished beneath the waves, not gradually erased over geological ages, but in some cases submerged within a single human lifetime. If humans were living in those exact coastal regions when this happened, what, if anything, would be left for archaeologists to find today? Layered into this story is one disputed event that deserves to be presented honestly as exactly what it is: a live scientific controversy, not settled fact in either direction. Around 12,800 years ago, in the middle of this dramatic warming, the climate abruptly reversed. Temperatures plunged back toward near-glacial conditions for roughly 1,200 years, a cold snap geologists call the Younger Dryas, before ending just as abruptly, with some records showing warming of several degrees within a single decade. Some researchers propose that this sudden climate reversal was triggered, or worsened, by a cosmic impact or airburst, pointing to layers of microscopic spherules, nanodiamonds, and unusual platinum concentrations found at dozens of sites across multiple continents, dated to almost exactly this boundary. This idea, known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, remains genuinely contested within mainstream geology and archaeology, and that contest has gotten more pointed rather than less in recent years. Comprehensive reviews published as recently as 2023 found no confirmed impact crater, no consistent physical scenario that all proponents agree on, and serious, repeated failures by independent labs to replicate some of the key supporting evidence. The hypothesis is rejected by most specialists in the relevant fields. No crater. No consensus. So why hasn't the debate simply ended? Proponents of the hypothesis point to a genuinely dramatic coincidence in timing. This exact window also saw the extinction of most of North America's Ice Age megafauna, mammoths, giant sloths, and saber-toothed cats among them, alongside the abrupt disappearance of the Clovis archaeological culture, one of the earliest well-documented human populations in the Americas. Correlation of this scale, they argue, demands an explanation beyond ordinary climate shift alone. At the same time, newer studies from 2024 and 2025, examining marine sediment cores from sites like Baffin Bay, have reported fresh platinum and microspheruleal evidence that proponents argue strengthens their case, keeping the debate active rather than settled. So, not proven, not simply dismissed either. A real, ongoing argument inside legitimate science, frequently oversimplified by popular media in both directions. Whatever caused it, the Younger Dryas climate swing happened during precisely the same window when sea levels were already in violent flux, meaning any human communities living through this period were facing climate chaos and a vanishing coastline at the same time, which raises an uncomfortable question for the conventional timeline of civilization. Were humans, during this exact window, capable of anything more sophisticated than simple survival? In 1994, an archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt visited a hill in southeastern Turkey that locals had farmed and grazed animals on for generations, occasionally turning up oddly shaped stone fragments nobody could quite explain. What he eventually excavated upended one of archaeology's most basic assumptions. Göbekli Tepe consists of multiple circular stone enclosures, some containing T-shaped limestone pillars over 5 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons, carved with detailed reliefs of lions, scorpions, vultures, and other animals. Radiocarbon dating places its construction at approximately 9,600 BCE, the same window, almost to the century, when Plato's Atlantis supposedly sank, and the exact period when those catastrophic meltwater pulses were reshaping coastlines worldwide. A monumental, deliberately complex structure, built 6,000 years before Stonehenge, and over 7,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids were ever raised. Here is what made it genuinely paradigm-breaking. The conventional model of civilization's development held that agriculture and settled farming had to come first, generating enough food surplus to eventually support organized religion and monumental construction. Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers. There is no evidence of agriculture at the site at the time of its construction. No domesticated grain, no permanent housing, no pottery. The order of operations that every textbook assumed was backward. Ritual and monumental ambition appear to have come first, with organized agriculture developing in the surrounding region only afterward. If hunter-gatherers with no farming, no metal tools, and no writing could organize the labor to move 20-ton stones and carve them with this level of detail, what else from this exact period might still be sitting unexamined, simply because no one expected to find it? And there is one more detail about Göbekli Tepe that deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. Around 8000 BCE, the site's builders did not simply abandon it. They deliberately buried it, filling the enclosures with rubble and sediment on purpose, for reasons no one has yet been able to explain with confidence. A monument this ambitious, built and then intentionally hidden. Why bury what you worked this hard to build? Excavations in the surrounding region, ongoing under what's known as the Taş Tepeler project, have since identified at least a dozen more sites sharing similar architecture and dating, scattered across the same stretch of southeastern Turkey. Göbekli Tepe, it turns out, was not an isolated freak occurrence. It was one node in what appears to have been a wider regional network of ritual sites, built by populations far more organized and far more widely connected than the term hunter-gatherer tends to suggest. Göbekli Tepe alone does not prove a lost global civilization. What it proves, conclusively, is that the timeline of human capability at the end of the Ice Age was significantly more advanced than mainstream archaeology assumed as recently as the 1990s. Which raises the natural next question this investigation has to ask. If humans at this exact moment in history were capable of monumental stonework on land, is there any physical evidence of comparable activity in the areas that subsequently went underwater? Before diving into the most contested sites, it's worth noting that submerged, once inhabited land is not by itself a fringe idea at all. Mainstream archaeologists fully accept the existence of Doggerland, a once dry expanse beneath what is now the North Sea, connecting Britain to continental Europe until rising post-Ice Age waters submerged it. Fishing trawlers have dredged up Stone Age tools, mammoth bones, and even a Neanderthal skull fragment from beneath those waters, and archaeologists continue to actively map its drowned river valleys today. Doggerland proves the basic premise beyond any argument. Real human landscapes, genuinely inhabited, really were swallowed by the sea at the end of the Ice Age, and the physical evidence really can survive underwater long enough to be recovered. The open question is not whether submerged human history exists. It demonstrably does. The open question is how much further it extends, and into how much deeper water. If Doggerland is real and well documented, why do the next sites in this investigation remain so bitterly contested by comparison? This is where the investigation moves from the well-established case of Doggerland into some of the most contested terrain in all of archaeology. Off the coast of Yonaguni Island in Japan, divers in 1986 discovered a submerged rock formation roughly 25 meters tall, with strikingly flat surfaces, sharp angles, and stepped, terrace-like features that some observers immediately compared to a stepped pyramid. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura spent decades studying the site and argued it showed clear signs of human modification, possible tool marks, what he interpreted as carved symbols, resembling an old regional script, and a layout he believed matched a deliberately constructed monument rather than a random rock formation. A trained marine geologist, convinced this was built by human hands. Surely his peers would simply confirm or refute it from there. Other geologists disagree just as firmly. Robert Schoch of Boston University, along with several independent research teams, has pointed to the site's geology directly. The rock is sandstone and mudstone, with extensive natural bedding planes and fracture lines, a type of stone well known to break along straight, geometric edges purely through erosion and tectonic stress, with comparable formations documented elsewhere along Yonaguni's own coastline, entirely above water and unambiguously natural. A formation that looks deliberately built to some trained eyes and naturally fractured to others, examined by credentialed geologists on both sides for nearly 4 decades, with no resolution in sight. Even Kimura's own position shifted significantly over time. He initially proposed the structure was at least 10,000 years old, dating to an era when it would have stood above water, a claim that, if true, would tie it directly to the Ice Age sea level story this episode has been building. He later revised that estimate down to roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years, after acknowledging that sea levels at that more recent date were already close to where they sit today. If the site's most prominent advocate revised his own dating this dramatically, how much weight should the original, more dramatic claim still carry? A similar pattern plays out at the Bimini Road, a striking, mostly linear arrangement of large, roughly rectangular limestone blocks discovered off the Bahamas in 1968, when a diver named Joseph Manson Valentine first spotted it in shallow water just off North Bimini. To enthusiasts, the formation has long looked like a paved road, a harbor wall, or even, in some of the more dramatic readings, debris from Atlantis itself. Given Bimini's proximity to the western Atlantic location, some Atlantis researchers favor. Geological surveys conducted since the 1970s identify the material as beach rock, a natural limestone that forms in shallow coastal waters and characteristically fractures into rectangular blocks along consistent, parallel lines. Radiocarbon dating of the formation places it at only a few thousand years old, and researchers studying the blocks closely note they are too rounded and eroded for any tool marks, had they ever existed, to have plausibly survived. A formation, in other words, that mainstream geology can fully explain without requiring any lost civilization at all, though the explanation has done remarkably little to slow the speculation surrounding it. Which brings the investigation back to where it began, that sonar anomaly off the coast of Cuba. The engineers who found it, Pauline Zalitsky and Paul Weinsweig, returned with more advanced equipment and recorded what appeared to be symmetrical stone structures spread across roughly 2 square kilometers of seafloor, at a staggering depth of 600 to 750 meters. Cuban marine geologist Manuel Iturralde Vinent, examining the same data, raised the objection that ultimately matters most. No known model of sea level change during the entire Ice Age comes anywhere close to placing a coastline at that depth. Even the most extreme reconstructions of Pleistocene sea levels place the maximum drop at little more than 130 meters below today's levels, leaving a gap of over 500 meters that no current theory of melting ice can account for. 500 meters that ordinary sea level science simply cannot explain. So what could? There is currently no conclusive evidence that the Cuban formation is artificial at all, and there is no scientific explanation for how a human-built structure could have reached that depth through sea level change alone. Some researchers have proposed large-scale tectonic subsidence as a possible alternative mechanism, the seafloor itself sinking, rather than the water simply rising around an unchanged coastline. Though this remains speculative, and the site has never received the sustained, well-funded scientific follow-up that a genuine discovery of this magnitude would normally demand. An anomaly this significant, sitting unexamined for over 2 decades, for reasons that have far more to do with funding and politics than with any final scientific verdict. Is that absence of follow-up itself part of the mystery, or simply an unglamorous case of underwater archaeology being expensive and difficult to fund? A similar geographic logic drives what's known as the Azores hypothesis, the proposal that Plato's Atlantis, if it existed at all, sat somewhere along the mid-Atlantic ridge near the Azores Islands, a real underwater mountain range where land genuinely was higher and partially exposed during the depths of the last ice age. Mainstream geologists studying the Azores point out a serious problem with the timeline. The islands themselves are young volcanic formations, built up over the past few million years, and there is no confirmed archaeological evidence anywhere in the region of a large, sophisticated civilization from the Ice Age, submerged or otherwise. When Portuguese sailors first reached the Azores in the 15th century, they found the islands entirely uninhabited, with no trace of prior human settlement at all. According to this interpretation, the Azores remain a geologically plausible location for land lost of the sea in general, without any specific, demonstrated connection to Plato's invented island in particular. A real, exposed ridge during the right geological era. No actual ruins to confirm anyone ever built anything on top of it. So where does that leave the broader theory connecting all of this together? Some alternative researchers argue that the convergence itself is the evidence. Flood myths on nearly every continent, a precisely dated philosophical account from Plato, a genuinely advanced monument at Göbekli Tepe, built in the exact same era, and a scattering of disputed underwater anomalies, taken together in this reading as fragments of a single forgotten chapter of prehistory, glimpsed only through myth because the physical evidence is sitting at the bottom of an ocean nobody has fully searched. At the more extreme edge of this territory sit theories that go considerably further than the evidence supports, claims that figures named in Mesopotamian myth, such as Enki and Enlil, were literal historical beings rather than deities within a religious tradition, or that catastrophic events in Earth's deep past were caused by an exploded planet rather than ordinary geological and climatic processes. There is no scientific evidence supporting either claim, and mainstream historians, archaeologists, and planetary scientists do not treat them as serious hypotheses. Distinguishing genuinely open scientific questions, like the Younger Dryas debate, from claims this far outside any evidentiary support is essential to taking the legitimate mysteries seriously. So where exactly does that leave the legitimate, still unresolved part of this story? It is important to be precise about where this leaves us. There is currently no conclusive evidence that Atlantis existed, that the Cuban formation is a confirmed city, that the Azores are Atlantis, or that any lost global civilization has been scientifically confirmed. Mainstream archaeologists and geologists generally conclude that the disputed underwater sites examined so far are either natural formations or simply lack sufficient evidence to support an artificial origin, and the flood myths, however numerous, are well explained by ordinary human experience, with coastal disaster repeated independently across cultures. Critics of the lost civilization hypothesis make one more point that deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. Extraordinary claims of this scale, if true, should eventually produce extraordinary, unambiguous physical evidence. And so far, despite decades of searching, that evidence has not materialized in any form mainstream science accepts as conclusive. Underwater archaeology is also, practically speaking, an order of magnitude more expensive and logistically difficult than excavating on land, which means the absence of conclusive evidence is not automatically equivalent to evidence of absence. It's a fair, evidence-based standard. And yet it leaves at least one observation sitting uncomfortably on the table, refusing to fully resolve in either direction. Göbekli Tepe alone proves that mainstream archaeology underestimated human capability at exactly this period in history, once dramatically, and only because someone happened to look in the right place. So what, honestly, remains unanswered after all of this? We do not know with certainty what caused the Younger Dryas, only that a real and currently unresolved scientific argument continues about it. We do not know whether the disputed underwater sites in Cuba, Japan, and the Bahamas are the fragmentary remains of something built by human hands, or simply geology that happens to look suggestive to the human eye. We do not know whether Plato's 9,000-year date was a genuine echo of something, or simply narrative convenience dressed up as precision. And we do not know how much of the Ice Age coastline, now sitting under hundreds of feet of water across the entire planet, has ever actually been searched with the same rigor archaeologists apply on dry land. 4 open questions. Not one of them resolved. So what can we actually say with confidence? What we do know is considerably more solid and arguably just as remarkable. Sea levels really did rise catastrophically at the end of the Ice Age, fast enough in places to erase an area of livable coastline larger than entire modern countries. Göbekli Tepe really does prove organized, monumental human effort at a level nobody expected from hunter-gatherers, built in precisely this same disruptive window. And flood myths really do appear independently in cultures separated by oceans and millennia, all converging on roughly the same basic shape: a great civilization, swallowed by water, remembered only in story. None of that proves Atlantis was real. None of it proves a lost global civilization existed. What it proves, more carefully and perhaps more interestingly, is that the boundary between definitely myth and definitely history is far less settled at the end of the last Ice Age than most people assume walking into this story. So, is there a real demonstrated precedent anywhere for taking that boundary seriously? Doggerland already proved that an entire inhabited landscape can vanish beneath the sea and still leave evidence behind, once someone finally goes looking in the right place with the right tools. The only real question this investigation leaves open is how many more Doggerlands are still waiting, undiscovered, in deeper and less hospitable water than any trawler has yet managed to reach. Maybe that uncertainty is the actual discovery here, not a sunken city waiting to be triumphantly found, but the much stranger realization that an entire chapter of the human story, somewhere between 15 and 10,000 years ago, remains genuinely unread, because most of the pages are sitting at the bottom of an ocean we have barely begun to search. If a real civilization really were down there, 600 meters under the waves off a coast nobody has fully explored, Would we even recognize the ruins for what they were? Or would they simply look, to most observers, like rocks?